Hello and welcome to another episode of Breakthrough Dialogues, the podcast for pragmatists and problem solvers brought to you by the Breakthrough Institute. I'm Alex Trembath, your host and deputy director at Breakthrough. One quick thing before we get going. A couple weeks from now, my producer Tali Perlman and I will be hosting our first Breakthrough Dialogues AMA, or Ask Me Anything, episode. So if you have any questions for us you'd like to hear answered, please either email us at info@thebreakthrough.org or tweet us at @thebti or at @atrembath. We'll be collecting the questions over the coming weeks, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. For this episode, I spoke with Jane Flegal. I've known Jane for many years, since she and I were both analysts in what feels like a whole past generation of conversations and controversies about climate change. Jane is now a program officer at the Bernard and Ann Spitzer Charitable Trust, which does fund the Breakthrough Institute, among many other organizations dedicated to work on climate change and other environmental and human development challenges. For this episode, Jane joins us more in her capacity as an adjunct faculty at Arizona State University, and we talked about climate risk, geoengineering, capital S science, and other stuff she and I have commiserated about over the years. Jane Flegal, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Alex Trembath. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. So I was preparing for this episode, and when I was setting it up, I realized I think it's just going to turn into a bit of an airing of Jane's grievances about climate policy and discourse.
Terrific. This is when I'm at my finest.
Yeah, I'm excited. We usually don't start with personal bios, but I realized, again, preparing for this, that I've actually known you for almost 8 years, since we were both analysts, myself at Breakthrough and you at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, and yada, yada, yada. Now I'm hosting this podcast and you're on this podcast. So can you fill in the gap there? Can you tell us what you have been up to in your career that has led you to where you are now and to your ultimate thinking about climate change?
Sure. Describe the yada, yada, if you will.
Exactly.
I worked as a policy analyst at the Energy Project of the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C., pretty much straight after college. I had done a bunch of political stuff as an undergrad and was an environmental science and politics double major, had no idea what I wanted to do. So I ended up in D.C. While I was there at the Bipartisan Policy Center, I led our work on energy innovation policy, including for the American Energy Innovation Council. And that's where we became such fast friends. And then I also, while I was at the BPC, was very reluctantly drawn into a project that pre-existed me on geoengineering. So I ended up staffing this task force on geoengineering research while I was there. And that, that sort of led to my next career move, which was that I was super, reluctantly drawn into the topic of geoengineering and then have not been able to fully escape it since. I think, the topic, geoengineering, for those who don't know, is a set of ideas, many of which remain quite speculative around how we might deliberately intervene in the climate system to counteract the effects of climate change. And as you might imagine, that bucket of ideas raises a whole host of pretty intractable questions at the intersection of science and society. So I got introduced to a field called science and technology studies, and really science and technology policy, which I hadn't really understood as like a field of academic research until this experience. Got to know both Dan Sarowitz and David Winikoff, who were on that geoengineering task force, and ended up leaving to go to UC Berkeley, where I did a PhD with Winikoff and Sarowitz on geoengineering research governance, and was finishing that PhD in 2018, and was then someone reached out to me and asked me to apply for a job in philanthropy, which I had not even really been fully contemplating, but that's where I find myself now. So I oversee the environment program at the Bernard and Ann Spitzer Charitable Trust, which is a family foundation in New York. And we are proud funders of the Breakthrough Institute, in addition to 35 other groups in the climate space.
Yeah, and I want to get back to your reluctance around geoengineering. If our listeners are interested, you have been on several podcasts and have written about that in several capacities.
Yeah.
But I don't want to spend this entire conversation on geo.
Yeah.
What I wanted to start with is this idea that I have seen you sort of pretty persistently and forcefully describing climate change as a risk management problem. And that sounds, I think, fairly anodyne, but I think you would argue that it's not. So can you tell us what you mean when you say climate change is a risk management problem and why it's maybe a little controversial?
Yeah, so it does feel anodyne, doesn't it? I think, there's been a tendency, at least early on, and I think this may be changing over time, to look at climate change as sort of a conventional problem of pollution control that could be, quote unquote, solved. And I think the way that I see this is that climate change is much better understood as sort of a persistent condition that societies are going to have to cope with. And that can only really ever be partially managed more or less effectively, essentially. And so that is sort of how I think about the climate problem. And there are a couple of implications of it. One is that I think it really foregrounds kind of the wickedness of the climate problem. I also think as part of that, it really highlights the need to be honest about some of the uncertainties around addressing climate and managing the risks effectively. It also kind of suggests or implies, in any case, a need to diversify the strategies for management to increase the odds of effective management. And then lastly, I think one of the implications of this is that you can't just bolt something on the end of a tailpipe and then the climate change problem goes away. So for one, we know that because of the persistence of CO2 and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and because of inertia in both social and climatic systems, we are committed to a certain level of climate change. And what that looks like remains relatively opaque, but it means that part of climate risk management, it's not just about reducing emissions, it's also about adapting to the climate change we are already committed to, and then potentially geoengineering to reduce the impacts of those changes.
You mentioned the wickedness of climate change, and I think what a lot of people hear when that term is thrown around is this is a really hard problem, but it's more than that. So can you describe what you mean when you say climate change is a wicked problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think when someone describes climate change as the wicked problem, part of it is that it's sort of impossible to give it a definitive definition. So the information you need to understand the problem is really kind of depends on the ideas for how you solve it. There's also no real rule about whether we can stop looking for additional understanding. This is a really open system, and so there's a lot of causal chains that interact, and there's no real end. So wicked problems are often kind of symptoms of other problems, and that's much, much different than kind of a discrete environmental problem to be solved. And that can be really, really frustrating for policymakers or advocates who are trying to solve them. I don't know if that's sufficiently clear, but
yeah, very much. So Ted Nordhaus, Breakthrough's executive director, and I wrote this essay a couple months ago, which you and I have talked about, sort of asking the rhetorical question: is climate change more like an asteroid, or is it more like diabetes? And this was prompted by the use of the climate change as diabetes metaphor. The idea there being, climate change is not something that is sort of cataclysmic like an asteroid that happens all at once, or that we have until 2030 or 2050 or whatever to solve. But it is much more, in our view, like you described. It's a risk management problem. We can manage it better or worse, as with a problem like type 1 diabetes. And it's also the kind of thing that if you don't manage it well, can actually kill you or kill the planet or whatever, which, we thought was a fairly reasonable way to talk about the problem, and ended up being a little bit more controversial than we were expecting. So can you talk
Yeah.
about that controversy and that sort of pushback to the idea of climate change as diabetes, or climate change as risk management? Like, why do people have a problem with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm speculating here a little bit, but I think one of the issues is the perceived tension between the urgency of addressing climate change and viewing it as a risk management problem or as a condition to be managed for better or worse, right? You know, this happens a lot also in the advocacy work that I've done in the past, which has tended to be kind of innovation forward. Like we really need to diversify the set of tools we have to manage climate risk. That seems like a very non-controversial view, especially when you're talking to folks who are not climate people. But the pushback tends to be, well, how can you say that? We don't have time to innovate. We don't have time to diversify. We need to pick a path and go. So there is kind of I think there's a temporal dimension that is sort of at the root of the controversy there.
Yeah, and another problem that I find with it is, who is we? I suppose in a sort of in an abstract way, I buy the argument that it's an urgent problem. We have to solve it as soon as possible. We can't wait for more technologies, and we can't wait to discover whether the uncertainties are better or worse, or whether we'll reach certain tipping points in the climate system, and we just have to pick a path and go. But you sort of alluded to sort of socio-technical political uncertainty a few minutes ago, which is a whole nother part of this mess. That even if you thought that we could sort of solve or come close to solving all of climate change's risks, in the next 10, 20 years, if we just sort of deployed certain technologies and adapted in certain ways, it's not at all clear who we is.
Yeah, I mean, there is always the agency question, for sure. So yeah, I mean, I think that is a huge problem. And I think, look, I mean, if it were, it is just very clear that while climate is an urgent problem that needs to be addressed yesterday, it is also not a cliff from which we fall. Every action matters, every intervention matters. And I think there have been a bunch of folks in the scientific community who have actually been pretty good about pushing back against that kind of deadlineism. On the other hand, in the context of advocacy around climate, I think it gets back to this urgency question. Between declarations of war on climate and, deadlineism around 1.5 degrees, it's actually not that surprising to me. I guess I have a hard time getting exercised about it, because I just feel like, well, of course this is the response by advocates.
Yeah, can you unpack that a little bit for us? Maybe starting with the idea of 1.5 degrees. So, last year the IPCC released a report, sort of on the impacts of 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels, which were projected to hit sometime in the next few decades. And I feel like that amped up a lot of this rhetoric around deadlineism in a way that we hadn't even seen, sort of before that. So can you talk a little bit about what happened there, with the report and with the reaction to it, and how you think that has changed what we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I think it has been useful, actually. I mean, there are issues for sure, but I think one needs to recognize that there's a lot of kind of the science tells us that 1.5 is the thing. And in fact, 1.5 is also a socially and politically constructed target. And early on, much was made of the fact that was something that kind of aspirational goal was something that small island states in particular were really advocating in the context of the UNFCCC, in part as a way to say, no, 2 is not even enough. So that's quite actually a political intervention. Then what happens is we run a bunch of models to try to solve for 1.5. And that's where I get a little more, grievancy full. I mean, I think that those models can tell us potentially lots of things that are useful, but they are not predictive. And there are models on top of models on top of models, making a whole host of assumptions. But I think what the bottom line was we are nowhere near where we need to be in terms of the effective management of climate risk. And so in that way, and I do think that in the wake of that report, lots of folks in the climate advocacy community and elsewhere kind of had that realization, which one would hope would lead to folks kind of revisiting some of their priors about what the right pathways were for climate change policy. So I think in that respect, it was quite useful. Where it becomes potentially more problematic is science says science can dictate, here's the path we need to take, or we fall off a cliff. Like that strikes me as less productive. On the other hand, I can understand why people cling to that, because there has been such a collective failure by societies, and I'm mostly talking about the US, but certainly elsewhere in the developed world, to reduce, like we have failed at decarbonizing, and people are freaked out, and it is an urgent problem in a bunch of ways. And trying to build a movement that acknowledges that urgency is difficult. So of course, folks are clinging to this, you know.
Right, and I feel like this gets back to a sort of dispute over what economists and other people call moral hazard. The sort of claim being that if climate change is a risk management problem, or if we are counting on new technologies, or we're counting on long-term adaptation, or counting on carbon removal, or we're counting on solar geoengineering, then that sort of lets everybody off the hook, and it means that we might not mitigate or we might not reduce emissions fast enough to meet these goals that we have, whether they're determined by science or anything else. What I see is, sort of an inverse moral hazard with that formulation, where if we're telling ourselves that we have until 2030 to solve climate change only with the technologies and practices we have available today, then we're actually setting ourselves up on a pretty bad footing for what will, in my view, certainly be actually a decades-long slog to mitigate, adapt to, manage the risks of climate change. And if we're not sort of honest about that, then we're not actually preparing ourselves to deal with the problem that will be with us for at least the rest of our lives.
Yeah. I mean, the moral hazard language is opaque at best. I mean, I think, and this is something that's come up in the context of the work that I've been involved with on solar geoengineering, mostly. Like there was this huge concern that because we assume that doing solar geoengineering, which is basically increasing the reflectivity of the Earth to cool the planet, because we assume that will be cheap, easy, and effective, asterisk, with a bunch of potential side effects. Because that's the way that the ideas have been framed. People have said, well, look, this is if this cheap, easy alternative will deter mitigation in the near term, like the allure, as you laid out, the allure of it. And interestingly, I think everyone worried that would be the case with solar geoengineering, but because we assumed, again, that carbon dioxide removal, which is kind of was for a while, like the less scary stepsister of solar geoengineering, because we assumed that would be expensive and hard. I think folks weren't quite as concerned about the potential for mitigation deterrence. But in principle, I think mitigation deterrence is a reasonable issue in the context of CDR and an SRM. I mean, my view is that it's an issue that we can think about managing, and that ought not keep these things off the table altogether. It's not lost on me that people have made similar arguments about adaptation in the past. And I think that, again, our collective failure to invest and address issues of adaptation, it has been just I'm sort of disgusted by it, to be honest. So it's not framing these things as kind of an either or is problematic. This goes back to risk management. You have to diversify. We just don't have the luxury. And that is kind of, an easy and obvious answer, but I think it's really important to keep in mind.
You mentioned that there's this view, maybe coming from the IPCC report that we talked about, and certainly other things that, quote, the science tells us that 1.5C is the thing, which gets back to another thing that you and I have commiserated about a lot over the years, which is a question about sort of what is the value of science, and in particular, what is the value of physical science in these socio-technical, political, decision-making processes. I feel like in climate change, maybe more than most other problems, we hear a lot about how the science is telling us to do X. And you have spoken and written very eloquently about how that's problematic. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, we tend to, in the US for sure, have a set of expectations about the ability of science to resolve political and value disputes, which are like basically empirically unfounded, to be frank. We don't have a lot of examples, at least on issues where values are contested and the stakes are high, where that has really ever happened. And so I think that is a huge problem. The other piece of this is that in the climate context, we have a hell of a lot of science and maybe not enough technology. And that, that's certainly a good example of this is in the case of carbon dioxide removal and geoengineering, where we're baking, if we consider integrated assessment models to be a form of science, we're baking in assumptions about the deployment of a technology that doesn't yet exist. And that creates some really screwed up dynamics. So I think, I think that just suggests that we need to be thinking a lot more about the development of socio-technical systems and a lot less about capital S science as if that's even a thing.
Yeah, how do we do that? How does capital S science, or more practically, how can scientists sort of better formulate their own value to socio-political, technical problems like climate change, if science, as I agree, can't tell us what to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of recommendations. And look, I'm a social scientist, and this applies to me too. In general, I think, particularly in the climate context, and I don't mean this as a critique of climate researchers, which I consider myself to be one, but I think in general, we need to exercise a lot more humility about the role of science and scientists in society. And part of this is about building or rebuilding public trust in expert institutions. I mean, I think there's been a lot of overstepping, to be honest, by scientists kind of across the board, claiming expertise on topics for which their expertise is either not that relevant actually, or for sure they do not have a monopoly on the only kinds of expertise that are relevant. So I guess that's one sort of recommendation: acknowledge the limits of expertise, and exercise a little bit of humility in that regard. The other thing is that for issues where, again, like values are really in dispute, the stakes are high, there's a lot of uncertainty. Folks like Dan Sarowitz have made recommendations about the need to really, there is such a thing as an excess of objectivity, because then you're just equipping contesting parties with their own bodies of evidence to support their positions. So in those cases, it might be worthwhile to take a step back and actually attend to the political questions and the value-based questions and try to think about mechanisms to sort through those. And then at that stage, science might be able to step in and help identify pathways to achieve shared goals. I actually think this dynamic can help explain the current kind of research impasse on solar geoengineering. The question of like, should we be researching this thing, right? At the moment, we are doing a bunch of modeling work to try to like reach some imagined evidentiary threshold to either justify doing more research or justify not doing any more research, as if that's ever going to answer the question, which is fundamentally kind of a values question and political question.
This has been my thing for several years now. I feel like, with the 1.5 degree report, you had this another round of sort of statements about how this, the climate science, the atmospheric science is telling us that we have to do these things. And there's this hope baked into that assertion that, there's more science now. There's more drastic science. There's more certain science that climate change is a problem. We have to reduce emissions as fast as possible. But, we've seen for like 40 years now that, pretty certain and pretty robust science doesn't actually, sort of immediately motivate radical action towards emissions reductions or decarbonization or anything like that. So I've become at the same time sort of less faithful in climate science to motivate that kind of action, but more faithful that we need good climate science to have a better sense of what are the implications and impacts of certain solar geoengineering regimes and technologies. What are the sort of expected local and regional impacts of warming around the world, which is a area of climate science that, as I understand it, it's much less understood than we would like, and much less understood than our understanding of the global climate system. We just don't know with any certainty what impacts on local warming or drought and heat waves or sort of local sea level rise and storm surges and effects on crop productivity. That stuff is much less understood and much more sort of practically useful if it's available to sort of political actors on the ground. I find myself both sort of frustrated, like you are, with capital S science and scientism and this excessive objectivity, and sort of in longing or very hopeful for sort of a more informative climate science going forward.
Well, look, I mean, I think the science can be quite useful, but it needs to be disciplined by something, whether that's technology development. I mean, technology development can exert quite a disciplining and focusing force on science. The way scientific research programs are structured, the way that science is matched up with the demand for that science kind of institutionally, those are all ways to discipline the science. And I think much of the research in the climate space, perhaps, but certainly from my experience in the solar geoengineering space, where there is not a clear demand function and not technology development at the moment to discipline the science, is a little bit so supply driven that it's sort of created some problems, I think. And look, like, this is controversial, and I don't mean to denigrate climate science at all, because it's been pretty amazing, actually. But, equilibrium climate sensitivity is one area where it's more research has actually widened the range of uncertainties, arguably, and not made them smaller. So this expectation that just doing more research will make us more certain, I would really take issue with. And in truth, like, we knew that emissions would contribute to climate change from like Arrhenius. So some of the, I actually think climate, one of the things that's
real quick, Jane, Arrhenius was a scientist around in the 1800s.
Yes, that's right. And the reason I'm saying that is not to denigrate the exercise in climate research at all, but to say we, and by we I mean climate advocates who rely on climate science and climate researchers. I feel like we are holding ourselves to like a ridiculously high evidentiary standard to justify action. Like, societies, governments make decisions about all kinds of policy matters in really uncertain domains all the time. That's like how decisions get made about armed conflict and like monetary policy. And so, instead of always trying to meet a higher and higher evidentiary standard, often thrust upon climate science by deniers or skeptics, I often think like, if we really took a step back and just said, like, no, like, we know enough to know that what we roughly need to do. Like, let's just get to work,
Yeah, the increased uncertainty from more sort of global atmospheric climate science, it actually furthers that view. If there's more uncertainty,
Sure,
that actually adds urgency to
that's right.
to the imperative to reduce emissions.
That's right.
As a risk management problem, we've known for a long time, and we actually know more and more. But we've known for a long time that we need to reduce emissions as quickly as possible, and it stops being a question of how fast does the science have to tell us to do that, and much more, almost entirely a question of how do you arrange technology and society to enable that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You mentioned that, solar geoengineering describes a set of practices and technologies that, as you've said many times, don't exist yet.
Yeah.
And that creates problems for how we think about its utilization and how we model impact on the global climate system using solar geoengineering in those models. So I can think of a couple other technologies that don't exist yet. One that Breakthrough is very concerned about: advanced nuclear reactors. I'm very excited about the prospect of those, but we haven't deployed a single one to date. And another thing people talk about a lot is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So sort of very large scale carbon dioxide removal, mostly via sort of production forests. And then other things, certain types of synthetic fuels. Certain types of carbon capture technology, certain types of batteries. So there are a whole bunch of technologies that don't exist yet, like solar geoengineering. So when we talk about relying on all of those, do we talk about the same thing, or do we talk about solar geoengineering in a particularly problematic way?
Yeah, no, this is I've been thinking about this a lot lately. And I would say a couple of things. I mean, I do think that there is something arguably qualitatively different between kind of harm reduction via reducing the actual thing we have done to create the harm. In other words, reducing emissions, and harm reduction via the idea of geoengineering. Like, there is a qualitative difference there that is relevant, I think, to some of this. The other piece with solar geoengineering, at least the way that we think of it now, is that it's very high leverage. And by that, I mean, you could do it here and it would inherently have global effects. I don't think advanced nuclear reactors are exactly the same. There might be, there are parallels there. These things are all related, but slightly different. And then the last thing I would say with all of this is that, Steve Raynor wrote this great piece about what would Evans Pritchard, who's an anthropologist, make of the 1.5 degree target, and in particular, assumptions about bioenergy with CCS. And one of the things he says is like, look, the line between ambition and delusion is not always especially sharp, especially when it comes to climate policy and imagined technologies. And yet, the kind of magical thinking that's happening ought to be disciplined by at least some scientific and social scientific understanding of the world. So this paper that came out recently about like dumping some insane amount of ice on the Arctic on the West Antarctic ice sheet to refreeze it or keep it frozen had like really crazy engineering assumptions and cost assumptions built in that were just like kind of deeply unreasonable, and by any stretch of the imagination. So like, I do think that there are boundaries that we can kind of draw around, it's all sort of magical thinking, but it needs to be rigorous magical thinking.
Sure. We've been talking about the sort of messiness and obviously the wickedness of a problem like climate change. I want to sort of close by asking you, either in climate change discourse or outside of it, do you feel hopeful about anything in the world?
Yeah, like I actually think that I'm really excited by some of the shifts I see in the way that folks are thinking and talking about some of these climate related issues. So like on the mitigation side, instead of kind of, imagining one comprehensive carbon tax or price on carbon or one magical regulation that's going to change the entire global economy, I think we're seeing much more of an acknowledgement of a kind of proactive vision of actually building a zero carbon economy rather than just reducing emissions. And much of that is kind of taking a much more sectoral look at mitigation. But I'm inspired by that kind of reframing. I think we are seeing kind of cracks in the denialism on climate on the right. There are a whole bunch of other things to worry about, but that is potentially a cause for optimism. I think like the conversation around climate and development feels to me like it might be getting slightly more sane, like a greater acknowledgement of the need for zero carbon energy for development and not just for residential lighting, for example. And I think Breakthrough has had a big role in that, as have Todd Moss's new Energy for Growth Hub, I think, is doing really good work in that regard. And so these are all things that I think are positive signs. Yeah. So, I'm cautiously optimistic.
I think I share in that cautious optimism. Jane Flegal, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to Breakthrough Dialogues. If you like our show, tell your friends, rate us, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or whatever platform you get your podcasts. Like I mentioned at the top, please send us your questions for our upcoming AMA episode, either by emailing info@thebreakthrough.org or tweeting us at the BTI or at @Trembath. I want to again thank my guest, Jane Flegal, and our producers, Alyssa Kadaman and Tolly Perlman. Catch you next time.